The arrow took Ursa Wildheart through the meat of her left thigh at dusk, and she made it 400 yards through the highland bracken before her leg gave out entirely. Abraham Wallace was not a soldier, not a ranger, not even a man with a particularly impressive reputation. He was the night watchman of Coltalo, a small trading settlement tucked at the base of the fjord cliffs, a man whose primary duties involved lighting the 8 oil lanterns along the dock road every evening and making sure that drunken fishermen did not fall into the black water below. He carried a short truncheon and a belt knife. He wore a heavy wool coat with brass buttons down the front, and he earned 14 coppers a week for his efforts. He was 29 years old, broad-shouldered in a quiet, unremarkable way, with dark brown eyes and a jaw that needed shaving twice a week, and usually only received it once. He was not supposed to be 2 miles past the clan hold's eastern boundary at the edge of the highland moor at sunset. He was there because Elder Brecken's prize hound had slipped its chain 3 days running, and tonight Abraham had tracked the foolish animal all the way to the heather flats before finding it nose-deep in a rabbit warren, completely indifferent to his annoyance. The dog was tucked under his left arm, squirming when he heard the sound. It was not a cry for help. It was not a groan. It was a sharp, controlled exhale, the kind of sound a person makes when they are refusing to make any other kind of sound, and it came from behind a stand of gorse to his right. Abraham set the hound down, looped its lead around a boulder, and pushed through the gorse with his lantern held out ahead of him. She was on her hands and one knee, the other leg extended behind her, both palms flat against the cold earth. The arrow shaft had broken off 6 inches above her thigh. She had done that herself, he realized, snapped it so it would not catch on anything while she moved. The remaining stub of it jutted from dark green-gray skin that was sheened with exertion and cold sweat. The wound was bleeding steadily, soaking through the split seam of the fitted leather breeches she wore, the dark blood almost black in the lantern light. She had a leather bodice laced tight over a sleeveless undershirt, dark-stitched and close-fitting, with 2 crossed baldricks over her shoulders from which the sheaths of twin short swords hung empty. She had lost the blades somewhere, or thrown them, or traded them for her escape. A wide woven belt cinched her waist. Leather bracers on her forearms, cracked at the left elbow where something hard had hit her. She was tall, even crouching, with the kind of build that spoke of 10 years of honest combat, all controlled muscle and coiled strength, and a face that was striking in its severity, with high, sharp cheekbones, deep amber eyes, a strong jaw set hard against pain, and 2 lower tusks that pressed white against her upper lip as she breathed through her teeth. She heard him coming and turned fast, one hand going to a belt knife that she absolutely had the strength to use. "Don't," she said. One word flat and final. "All right," Abraham said. He stopped. He looked at the arrow stub. He looked at her face. He said, "You have been shot. I noticed. How far have you walked on it?" She didn't answer. Her eyes moved from his face to his coat to his belt knife to the lantern and back to his face, running calculations he could see her running. "I'm the night watchman," he said, as if that explained something. "My name is Abraham Wallace. I'm not going to hurt you. I'm not carrying a bow and I have no reason to. Can you stand?" "I can stand," she said, and she proved it by straightening to her full height, which was 2 inches taller than him, and then immediately pressing her back against the gorse because her leg had sent a signal up her spine that standing was technically possible but deeply unwise. "Right," he said. He set the lantern down on the boulder beside the hound, shrugged his coat off his shoulders, and moved toward her with the unhurried steadiness of a man who had once spent 4 hours coaxing a merchant's wife off a dock railing in a storm. "Put your arm over my shoulder." She looked at him. "I do not need. I know you don't need it. Do it anyway." There was a silence that lasted the length of several slow heartbeats. Then Ursa Wildheart, warrior of the Wildheart bloodline, veteran of the border campaigns, bearer of the clan Rothgar honor mark on her right shoulder, put her arm over the night watchman's shoulder with an expression of controlled dignity that suggested she was doing him a favor. He wrapped his right arm around her waist, took her weight, and they started moving. What Abraham did not know was that, after the first 100 yards, the blood loss and the cold and the evening's exertion caught up with Ursa in a way she had not anticipated. The edges of her vision began to go soft. She was aware of it the way a person is aware of water rising around their ankles slowly, then all at once. She made a decision, quickly and privately, to hold on a little longer. She did not make it another 20 yards. She was not unconscious. She was certain of that. She was simply operating at a significant deficit, eyes closed, body gone loose, mind still running underneath the surface like a river under ice. She felt the shift when he stopped. She felt him lower himself to one knee without dropping her. She felt the exact moment he made a decision she had not expected, because he repositioned her, got his right arm under her knees and his left arm behind her back, and then he stood up with her. He did not grunt. He did not stagger. He set his footing carefully, adjusted her weight, and he walked. She held very still. She told herself she was holding still because moving would be painful. She kept her eyes closed. She listened to his breathing, which was measured and effortful but not panicked. She felt the rhythm of his steps, 3 miles of highland track between them and the clan hold's longhouse, across the dark moor with nothing but a lantern he had somehow managed to hook to his belt while keeping both arms around her. She felt the ground change under his feet, soft heather to packed earth to the stone-cobbled road that wound up from the fjord. She heard him speak once quietly to the hound trotting ahead of them on its lead, something low and encouraging. She felt him adjust his grip when the track tilted upward on the approach to the hold's gate, leaning back slightly to compensate for her weight. He was not a large man. She was not a small woman. She had no illusions about what this cost him. She kept her eyes closed the entire way. The gate guard, a young man named Petter who was 17, and had never been told how to handle this particular situation, saw Abraham Wallace come up the track with an unconscious orc warrior in his arms and the elder's runaway hound at his heels, and he made the only decision available to him, which was to throw the gate open and shout for the hold's healer. The healer was Marta, a small, silver-haired woman of 60 who had sewn up everyone from the Jarl's son to a wolverine-bitten fur trader, and she did not blink at the situation. She directed Abraham to the long infirmary table in the ground-floor hall of the main longhouse, which was warm from the central fire and lit by a half-dozen oil lamps hanging from the beams. Abraham laid Ursa down on the table. Marta looked at the arrow stub, at the blood-soaked leather, and then at Abraham's face. She said, "You walked her in from the moor." "Carried," he said. "You carried an orc warrior 3 miles from the moor. She was shot." Marta looked at him for another moment in a way that suggested she was filing this information away for later use. Then she said, "Go wait outside, and take that dog with you." Ursa Wildheart cracked her eyes open 1 millimeter when the footsteps receded, confirmed she was not dead, and then closed them again and let Marta work. The arrow had gone deep but had not touched the bone. The blood loss was significant enough that Marta made her drink 2 cups of iron broth and bound the leg in wool wadding and tallow-soaked linen. She was efficient and unsentimental, and she did not ask what an orc woman with honor marks and empty sword sheaths had been doing on the highland moor alone at dusk. She bandaged the wound and left a clay cup of pain powder on the table and went to the door. Abraham was sitting on the stone step outside, the hound asleep across his feet, his coat back on. He looked up. "She will live," Marta said. "She needs 3 days minimum before that leg will take real weight. She needs feeding and she needs to stay off the moor." She looked at Abraham with the particular expression of a woman who has decided something. "She'll want an answer from you when she wakes up. What are you going to do?" He looked at the lantern hanging from the eave above the door. "She has nowhere to go for 3 days," he said. "My place is on the upper lane. It's small, but it's warm." Marta nodded once. "Good," she said, as if this had been the obvious answer from the beginning. Ursa woke at the hour before dawn to the smell of wood smoke and salt and the specific discomfort of having pretended to be unconscious for longer than was strictly necessary. The fire in the infirmary hearth had died down. The oil lamps were guttering. There was a thin blanket over her, rough but clean, and a bowl of cold broth on the table beside her. She sat up carefully. Her leg announced its objections. She ignored them in the methodical way she had been ignoring objections from injured parts of herself since she was 15 years old, and her training master had thrown her into the river to teach her to swim while wearing chain. The door to the infirmary was open. Dawn was an hour away. In the gap of the doorway she could see the cobbled lane and the dark fjord below, and she could see Abraham Wallace sitting on the same stone step, because it became apparent to her that he had been sitting there all night. He had a small sketchbook open on his knee and a stick of charcoal in his hand, and he was drawing the fjord in the dark by the light of the lamp on the eave. His coat was buttoned to the throat. He was not asleep. He was simply there, steady as a mooring post, doing something quiet with his hands. Ursa watched him for a full minute. She had been shot by a man from a rival trading faction who had followed her from the lowland market at Draven's Ford, where she had gone to settle a debt on behalf of Clan Hrothgar's war chief. The debt was complicated and ugly. The war chief had signed a binding trade contract with a merchant named Godwell 3 years prior, pledging Hrothgar iron and furs in exchange for coastal passage rights. Godwell had sold that contract to a speculator named Renwick, who had subsequently claimed the contract entitled him to 40% of the clan's highland grazing land, which it did not. Ursa had been sent to tell Renwick, diplomatically, that his interpretation was incorrect. Renwick had apparently decided that the most efficient response was to have her shot on the road home. She had dealt with worse than Renwick. She would deal with Renwick. But first she had to get off this table without gripping the doorframe for support, and she was calculating the logistics of this when Abraham said, without turning around, "There's hot water on the hearth hook if you want broth." She was quiet for a moment. "How did you know I was awake?" "You have a different sound when you're breathing," he said. He still hadn't turned around. He said it simply, without flourish, as if it were a practical observation. "When you're awake, your breathing is controlled, different rhythm." She looked at the back of his head. "You were listening." "I was sitting 12 feet away all night," he said. "It wasn't a choice." She got herself off the table with dignity, accepted the necessity of the cane Marta had left leaning against the wall, and crossed to the door. She stood in the gap and looked down at him on the step. He looked up at her. In the thin pre-dawn light she could see his face properly for the first time, direct dark eyes, a few lines around them from squinting into wind, a mouth that was set seriously but not unkindly. "Why?" she said. He looked at her steadily. "Why what? Why did you carry me?" "Because you needed carrying," he said. "I could have managed." He held her gaze without flinching. "You were unconscious." "I was not." She stopped. She started again. "I was close to it." "Close to it," he agreed politely. There was something in his expression that told her he had measured the distance between close to it and actual unconsciousness, and had privately arrived at his own conclusions, which he had apparently decided were hers to keep. She found, to her own annoyance, that she did not know what to do with this. "Where is the hound?" she said. "I took it back to Elder Brecken at midnight. He gave me half a wheel of cheese. I left it on the healer's counter." He closed his sketchbook. "There's a room at my place. Marta says you can't travel for 3 days. It isn't much, but it's warm and I don't bother people." She looked at him for a long time. Sat with a quality of patience that was not performative. He was not waiting for something from her. He was simply waiting. "I am not paying you," she said. "All right. I don't want your charity." "It isn't charity," he said. "I was already going that direction." She looked at the lantern above the door. It was the last lit lantern on the lane. She could see that the others, which presumably he had lit at dusk, had burned down in the night. She looked at the sketchbook in his hand. She looked at him. "Fine," she said. His house on the upper lane was, as advertised, small. One main room with a bed frame, a table, 2 chairs, a stone hearth, and a shelf of accumulated items. a spare lantern, 3 small sketchbooks, a bundle of charcoal sticks, a tin of lamp oil, a leather-bound ledger that turned out to be his watchman's duty record, a chipped mug with a handle shaped like a fish, and 3 smooth river stones lined up on the windowsill for no apparent reason. There was a loft above with a second sleeping area, little more than a bedroll on a wooden platform, which is where Abraham slept and which he reached via a short ladder. He put her in the bed. He went up the ladder. He left a banked fire and a cup of clean water and the cane within reach. In the morning she woke to the sound of him moving around below, and she lay still for several minutes, listening to the ordinary sounds of a man starting a day, the scrape of a pot, the snap of a fire being fed, the particular silence of someone who is comfortable in their own company. She had not slept anywhere that felt like this in a long time. She could not immediately identify what the feeling was. She lay still until she did. It felt like there was no danger in this room. Not managed danger, not contained danger, not the kind of comfort that depended on her own readiness to meet a threat. Just actual quiet. It was so unfamiliar that it had taken her unconscious mind half a night to stop cataloging it as suspicious. She got up. Her leg was stiff, but the wound was clean and the bandaging was holding. She came down the stairs cane first and found Abraham at the table with 2 bowls and a pan of oat porridge on the trivet. "Sit down," he said, and then immediately said, "Sorry. I mean there's food if you want." She sat down. She watched him ladle porridge into both bowls with equal portions, unhurried, and she noticed that he had put the bowl with the less burned bottom crust in front of her. He sat across from her and ate without looking at her with the intensity of a man trying not to stare, and she found this more interesting than most of the conversations she had in a given month. "What happened to you on the moor?" he said after a while. She told him. Not everything, not the inner architecture of it, but the relevant shape. The contract, the merchant, the rival faction, the arrow. She told it plainly as she would report a scouting incident, and watched his face while she did. He listened without interrupting. He did not look shocked or worried or performatively outraged on her behalf. He looked, she thought, like someone processing information. When she finished, he said, "Renwick, that's the man with the converted warehouse at the Dravens Ford docks. You know him." "I know of him. He's been trying to claim disputed road levy rights on the fjord track for 2 years. Elder Brecken's been in correspondence with the lowland magistrate about it. He ate a spoonful of porridge. He said, he'll try again. Shooting you didn't solve his problem with the contract." "No," she said, "it did not." "What will you do?" She looked at him. "I'll go back when my leg lets me." He nodded as if this were the expected answer. He said, "Do you want me to come with you?" She stared at him, not with hostility, with the specific expression of a person who has been offered something entirely outside the range of expected offers and is taking a moment to determine whether it is genuine. "You are a night watchman," she said. "I know what I am. You light lanterns." "Among other things," he said. She studied him. His expression was calm. He meant it. He was a man who had sat on a cold stone step all night, because it had seemed to him like the right thing to do, and he was now offering to walk into a merchant's dispute with an orc warrior he had met at the business end of an arrow stub, because it had apparently also seemed to him like a thing worth offering. She did not understand him. She decided she would think about it. 3 days passed. She stayed in the bed. She ate his food, which was plain but good, and she watched him go out at dusk and come back at dawn, and she watched him sleep for 6 hours in the loft and then come down and go about the small business of his day with the same unhurried steadiness. She asked him on the second evening what he had done before the night watch, and he said he had been a gravedigger for 3 years after coming north, and before that a laborer on the road gangs, and before that a farm boy in the lowland valleys where the soil was thin and the winters were mean. He said all of this without any apparent embarrassment or desire for her sympathy, as if he were simply reporting geography. She told him carefully some things about herself, the honor mark, the training, the 2 border campaigns. She did not tell him about the wound she had taken at the Battle of Grayford 10 years ago, the one that had gone through her ribs and left a scar she was still not entirely at peace with, because she did not know why she would tell him that. She told him on the third morning. She didn't plan to. They were sitting by the fire because she had dragged her chair to the hearth and he had moved his without comment, and she was examining the scar on her forearm from the cracked bracer, and she said, suddenly, "I was 22 at Grayford," and then she told him about it. He listened. He did not say, "I'm sorry." He did not say, "That sounds awful." He said quietly when she finished, "You were still standing after that. Eventually." "That's the whole story then," he said. "That's exactly who you are." She did not know what to say. She was not accustomed to that kind of response. She looked at the fire. Her jaw was tight. She unclenched it deliberately. On the third evening, when her leg had knit enough that she could walk without the cane if she was careful, she told him she was well enough to move back to the Clanhold's guest quarter. He said all right. He put her cane by the door. He did not try to make her stay. She got to the door. She stopped. "You offered to come with me," she said, "to Draven's Ford." "I did. I'd like to settle this business with Renwick before his next move." She looked at the door rather than at him. "Elder Brecken would need to release you from the watch rotation for a few days. Do you think he would?" "He owes me 2 days overtime from last autumn," Abraham said, "and his hound." She looked at him over her shoulder. He was sitting at the table in his big wool coat, and his expression was the same as it always was, steady and unhurried, and his dark eyes were on her face with something in them that she was finding increasingly difficult to categorize as anything other than what it obviously was. "All right," she said. "Come then." Elder Brecken was a heavy-set, bearded man of 55 who had governed the Coldtlow hold through 2 bad winters and a flooding season, and had the disposition of someone who had learned to take unusual things in stride. When Abraham came to him the following morning with the request for leave, Brecken looked at him for a long time. "You're going south with the Wildheart woman," he said. "Yes, to confront Renwick, on a contract matter." Brecken stroked his beard. He said, "Renwick had her shot." "He did. And you want to go back with her?" "She asked me to." Brecken looked at him with an expression that Abraham could not quite read and then said, "Take 5 days and take my sword, the good one, not the hanging piece." He went to the wall peg and lifted down a sheathed short sword with a brass crossguard. He held it out. "You can't go into a merchant's dispute carrying a truncheon." Abraham took the sword. "Thank you," Brecken said. "Come back in one piece, both of you." The road south from Coldtlow to Draven's Ford took 2 days at a comfortable pace, which was the pace Ursa's leg dictated, and Abraham found himself noting that she never complained about it or mentioned it in any way except once, when they had been walking for 4 hours and he said they should stop for water and she said they could keep going, and he said, "Your leg has been bleeding through the bandage for the last mile." And she looked down and said, succinctly, and they stopped. He redressed the wound by a creek with the spare linen strips Marta had sent along, kneeling in the grass while she sat on a flat stone above him, and his hands were practical and gentle, and he did not make her feel like an invalid. When he finished, she said, "You are better at this than you should be." "I used to be a gravedigger," he said, rolling the soiled linen. "You learn to manage the practical things." She looked at him kneeling in the grass by the creek in the autumn light, and she felt something shift quietly inside her, the way ice shifts in a river when the temperature turns. She did not say anything about it. They camped the first night under the ridge of a limestone outcropping, out of the wind. He built a fire without drama and shared the bread and dried meat from his pack, and she contributed the flask of Orkmaid grain spirit that she had apparently been carrying in her pack the entire time she had been unconscious in his house, which seemed to him like an admirable level of preparedness. They drank in turns, sitting on either side of the fire, and she told him more about the contract situation, the specific clauses, Renwick's legal arguments, the magistrate's likely position, and he listened and asked sharp, precise questions that told her he was following the logic rather than just appearing to listen, and she found this sharply, unexpectedly attractive. "You know what the contract actually says," she said. "I read the magistrate's public summary," he said. "It was in the hold's correspondence file. I read everything in the hold's correspondence file. It's something to do on quiet nights." She looked at him across the fire. "You read legal correspondence for entertainment." "Not for entertainment," he said, "because the town I'm responsible for watching is in a watershed moment with half a dozen competing claims on it, and I like to know what's coming." She was quiet. She said, "You care about the town." "I care about the people in it," he said. "The town is just stones." She looked at the fire. She said slowly, "My clan's war chief cares about the clan, not the people specifically. The clan as a thing, as a force, as an idea. I have noticed this is different." He looked at her. She was watching the fire with the expression she wore when she was thinking about something with more intensity than her face wanted to admit, which he had already, in 3 days, learned to recognize. He said, "Is that why they sent you alone, to settle this debt?" "They sent me because I'm the one who is good at settling things." "But alone?" She didn't answer. The fire crackled. He did not push the point. He put 2 more sticks on the fire and wrapped himself in his bedroll and lay down and said, "Good night," and went to sleep. She sat by the fire for another hour watching him breathe in the firelight, still and regular and untroubled, and she thought about the fact that he had carried her 3 miles across dark highland moor without being asked, without expectation, and had then sat up all night on a stone step and drawn the fjord in the dark. And she was beginning to understand that the man she was looking at was one of the rarest things she had encountered in her life, which was someone whose goodness was not a performance. It made her feel, in a way she was not going to examine before she had to, terrifyingly vulnerable. They reached Draven's Ford by midday of the second day. It was a lowland market town, larger than Coldtolow, with a main street of stone buildings and a waterfront district of converted warehouses and dock facilities. Renwick's operation occupied the largest of these warehouses, a 3-story stone building with a painted sign and guards on the door. Abraham had spent the second day of walking thinking about how to approach this. His conclusion was that direct was better than clever, because Renwick already knew the contract argument was weak, and what he needed was to understand that his position had become more expensive than the potential gain. They went to the magistrate first. The magistrate's name was Horst, and he was a lean man of 40 who had the look of someone who had been expecting this conversation. When Ursa laid the original contract document, which she had been carrying apparently along with the grain spirit on his desk, and pointed to the specific clause that Renwick had been misreading, Horst read it, looked at Abraham and said, "Who are you?" "I'm her advisor," Abraham said. Horst looked at him for a moment with an expression that suggested he had a great deal to say about this pairing, but had decided to focus on the document. He read the clause again. He said, "This is clear." The grazing land clause was explicitly carved out of the general conveyance. Renwick's counsel argues the carve-out was conditional on a payment schedule that was not met, Ursa said. Was the schedule met? She slid a second document across. 3-year payment confirmation from the original signatory, witnessed and sealed. Horst read it. He sat back. He said, "I'll issue a declaratory order this afternoon. Renwick's claim to the grazing land is void." He looked at them both with the expression of a man taking mental notes. He said, "He's going to be angry." "He already shot me," Ursa said. "He can be angry." Horst looked at the bandaging visible below her leather breeches. He looked at Abraham. He said, very quietly, "Good luck." They went to Renwick's warehouse. This is the moment the town remembered. The main street of Draven's Ford was occupied at that hour by market day traffic merchants, buyers, fishers with loaded carts, a line of people at the grain factor's door, 2 guards from the Ford garrison eating their midday food on a bench. The entrance to Renwick's waterfront property faced the main street across a wide cobbled plaza, and the guards on the door were 4, not 2, which meant someone had already told Renwick they were in town. Renwick came out before they reached the door. He was a thick-necked, florid man of 50 in a merchant's coat, and he came out with 6 guards and an expression of someone who has decided that aggression is still the correct strategy even in the face of a magistrate's sealed document. He pointed at Ursa. He said loudly in front of the entire market day crowd, "You do not have legal standing to appear here. You are an orc debt servant, and this matter was settled by your clan's default." The market stopped moving. Every head turned. Abraham felt the crowd's attention the way you feel a change in wind. He stepped forward. He was not a large man in a crowd of guards, but he was not behaving like a man who was aware of this. He said also loudly, clearly, "Ursa Wildheart is a clan representative with full legal standing under the charter of the Highland Trade Agreement which you signed 3 years ago. She is not a debt servant. She is not in default. She is carrying Magistrate Horst's declaratory order, sealed this morning, voiding your claim to Clan Rothger's grazing land." He took the order from his coat pocket and held it up. "Anyone who wants to read it is welcome." Renwick's face went from florid to scarlet. He said to his guards, "Remove them." 2 guards started forward. Ursa stepped to Abraham's left and reached to the baldricks on her back. She had, at some point between Coldtolow and Draven's Ford, acquired replacement blades. She had stopped at a Smith's on the South Road for 20 minutes while Abraham waited outside, and when she came out, she had been wearing them and had said nothing about it, and he had said nothing about it either. Now she drew both short swords simultaneously with the smooth, practiced motion of someone who has done this 10,000 times, and she said nothing, simply stood there with both blades out, and the amber eyes of a woman who has fought in 2 border campaigns looking at the 2 approaching guards, and the 2 guards stopped. The plaza was completely silent. Abraham held the magistrate's sealed order up higher. He said to the crowd, "Renwick has been attempting to claim highland grazing land that does not belong to him using a contract clause that has been legally and conclusively refuted. He also had this woman shot on the Highland Road 3 days ago. If anyone in Draven's Ford has outstanding business with Clan Rothger, come to the magistrate's office. The contract is sound. The debt is settled. This is over." He looked at Renwick. He said, quietly enough that only Renwick could hear, "The magistrate's order is already filed. If you have her touched again, or anyone from Clan Rothger touched again, you will lose the coastal passage rights too. Not because of the contract. Because Brecken of Coldtolow is writing to the garrison captain this week about your road levy dispute, and when the garrison captain reads the full file on your activities in this district, the passage rights will become the least of your concerns." He didn't know for certain that this was true. He knew it was a reasonable probability given what he had read in the Hold's correspondence file. He watched Renwick's face. Renwick said nothing. His jaw worked. He looked at Ursa with her blades out, and at Abraham with the magistrate's order, and at the crowd watching, and he made the calculation that every man makes when the calculus of aggression tips past the point of likely profit. He went back inside. The guards shuffled after him. The door closed. The crowd on the main street of Draven's Ford was still looking at them. Ursa sheathed her blades. Abraham folded the magistrate's order back into his coat. Then someone in the crowd, a woman at the grain factor's door, older, with a basket over her arm, began to clap, a slow, deliberate sound that traveled through the crowd like a current, and then several others joined, and the 2 garrison guards on the bench stood up and one of them offered a brief, ironic salute with 2 fingers. Ursa looked at Abraham. Something had crossed her face that he had not seen on it before, which was a kind of unguarded incredulity. "You bluffed him," she said. "Partially," he said. "The filing part was real. The Brecken letter was probable." She looked at him. She said very quietly, "You are absolutely not just a night watchman." "I light lanterns," he said. She looked at him for another moment, and then in front of the garrison guards and the woman with the basket and the grain factor's queue and everyone else on the main street of Draven's Ford, she reached out and put her hand on the side of his face with a deliberate, careful touch, the way you touch something you are deciding is yours. He went very still. He looked at her. She said, "Come on. I'm buying the meal this time." He covered her hand with his briefly before she lowered it. He didn't say anything. He didn't need to. The entire market street of Draven's Ford watched Ursa Wildheart and Abraham Wallace walk into the riverside inn together, and by evening the story had circulated through every establishment in town, and it would be several weeks before anyone stopped repeating the part about the orc warrior with the twin blades who had stood down 6 guards, while the town watchman bluffed a merchant lord with a sealed document, and possibly a spectacular amount of quiet nerve. The meal was the best Abraham had eaten in 2 years. She ordered for both of them, knowing the lowland food better than he did, and she ate with the straightforward appetite of someone who burns a great deal of fuel and has no pretensions about it. They sat across from each other in the riverview window of the inn, and the light was going amber off the water, and she was telling him something about the second border campaign, a specific winter deployment that had been badly managed by a sub-commander who had been subsequently removed from field duty. And he was asking questions, and she was answering them with increasing frankness, because she had found over 5 days that he asked exactly the right questions, the ones that went at the actual center of the matter rather than the comfortable edges. She stopped mid-story. He said, "What?" She said, "Nothing." She looked at the river. She said, "I have been talking to you for 5 days." "I know. I don't do that." She frowned, not at him, at herself. "I am not someone who talks." "I noticed," he said. "You talk anyway with me." He said it simply, without any implication of what it meant, just as a fact. She looked at him, the amber eyes, the particular color of the evening light on her face, the honor mark visible above the collar of her bodice, the mark she had earned at 25 in a ceremony that had cost her actual blood, 3 lines of deep blue-green ink pressed into the skin of her right shoulder with a bone stylus, the mark of a warrior who had been given the clan's trust and found worthy of it. She said slowly, "I want to tell you something." "All right." On the moor, she looked at the table. She looked back at him. She said, "When you picked me up, I was not entirely unconscious." He looked at her. He said nothing. "I was aware of most of it," she said. "I could hear you. I knew where we were on the road. I knew how far it was." She said with precision, "I made the choice to let you carry me." He was quiet. He said, "Why are you telling me this?" "Because I don't lie to people." She stopped. "People you what?" he said very quietly. She picked up her cup. She set it down. She said, "People I intend to keep in my life." The room was warm and the river was gold through the window, and Abraham Wallace looked at Ursa Wildheart across a table strewn with the remains of a good meal in a lowland inn, and he felt something settle in him with the quality of an anchor finding bottom, a deep, final, right thing. He said, "Good." She raised an eyebrow. "Good. I also intend to keep you in mind," he said. "So good." She looked at him for a long time. Then, for the first time in his knowledge of her, she smiled. It was not a small or uncertain thing. It was a complete, unreserved smile that changed the shape of her whole face and showed her tusks and the line of her jaw, and the way her amber eyes caught the light when she wasn't guarding them. It lasted several seconds. Then she composed herself and looked at the river and said, "We should get rooms." And he said, "Yes," and neither of them moved immediately. They rode back north the following morning with the magistrate's confirmation and the settled contract and the specific lightness of 2 people who have said something that cannot be unsaid and have discovered that this is not a burden but a relief. The road back took them through the Highland Pass, which was cold at that altitude even in early autumn, and they camped on the second night in a pine shelter above the tree line, with a better fire than the first night because Ursa had a very specific and efficient approach to building fires that involved an arrangement of stones Abraham had not seen before, and which was, demonstrably, better than his method. He told her so, and she said, "I know," without any apology for it, and arranged the stones with the practiced ease of someone who has camped in bad weather too many times to have any patience for inferior fire arrangements. He was watching her work and she felt him watching, and she said without looking up, "Ask what you want to ask." "I wasn't asking anything." "You have a face when you are trying not to ask something," she said. "I've had 5 days to learn it." He thought about denying this. He said, "You're planning to go back to the clan hold, Clan Rothgar." That is where I live. I know. He paused. He said, how far is the Rothgar hold from Coldtalow? She was still for a moment with her hands around a stone. She set it down. She said, a day and a half on foot. He nodded. He said, I could manage that. She looked at him. He was sitting with his back against a pine in his big coat with the brass buttons, entirely serious. She said, you would walk a day and a half, if there was reason to. She looked at him for a long moment. The fire was beginning to take hold between her arranged stones, small and fierce in the cold wind. She said, you could also simply come north. Clan Rothgar's hold at Ironspire is 2 days past Coldtalow on the fjord road. You wouldn't need to manage a day and a half at all. He said very carefully, what would I do at Ironspire? Whatever you do anywhere, she said. Watch, light things, read correspondence files. She looked back at the fire. There are things that need watching at the hold, things that need someone with the sense to read what is coming before it arrives. He said, Ursa, she said, still looking at the fire, I am not asking you to come because the hold needs a watchman. I know. I am asking you. She stopped. She started again with the careful precision of someone choosing exact words. I am asking you because I have been alone for a long time doing things that matter to other people, and I would like, she looked at him, the amber eyes, straight and unguarded, I would like to do something that matters to me. He crossed the distance between them in 3 moves deliberately and sat down beside her by the fire, close enough that his shoulder was against hers. She was still as a standing stone, watching him from the corner of her eye. He said, I have been a gravedigger, a road laborer, and a man who lights lanterns in a town that doesn't need much in the way of lighting. I have been on my own for most of it. I am not a warrior or a hero or a man with land or money or an impressive reputation. He looked at the fire. I am a man who sat on a cold step all night because it seemed like the right thing to do, and who can read a legal correspondence file, and who can carry a person 3 miles if the situation requires it. I know what you are, she said. I want to be sure you know, he said, because you are all of those other things, the warrior and the honor mark and the 2 campaigns, and I want you to have chosen me knowing exactly what I am. She turned to look at him. She said with absolute steadiness, I know exactly what you are. I chose you before we got to the fire. She paused. Before we got to Draven's Ford. She paused again. Possibly before we left your house in Coldtalow. He turned to look at her. They were close. The fire between the arranged stones was burning bright and clean, and the highland wind was cold on their backs. He kissed her, not tentatively, not with the hesitancy of a man unsure of his welcome. She had made her welcome entirely clear, and he was, underneath the patience and the quiet, not a man who lacked conviction. He kissed her with the warmth and focus of a man who had been paying close attention for 5 days and knew, with some certainty, what he wanted. She kissed him back with considerably more force, because she was Ursa Wildheart and she did not do anything by half measures, and she put her hand against his jaw the way she had done on the street in Draven's Ford, deliberate and claiming, and the fire snapped between its stones in the highland dark, and the pines moved in the wind around them, and she tasted like grain spirit and decided things. When they separated, she kept her hand against his jaw. She said, come north. Yes, he said. She moved her thumb against his cheekbone once slowly, and he covered her hand with his again, and they sat by the fire in the good, warm silence of people who have arrived at something real. They returned to Coldtalow 3 days after leaving, arriving at the gate in the blue hour before proper morning. Petter the gate guard stared at them, looked from Ursa to Abraham and back, and then said, welcome back, with the tonal control of a young man who has decided it is not his place to comment. Brecken met them in the hold's main hall over breakfast, and Abraham returned the sword with thanks and laid the magistrate's confirmation on the table, and Brecken read it and refilled everyone's cup and said to Ursa, I assume you are leaving us now that the business is settled. She said, in a few days. He looked at her. He looked at Abraham. He said, I see. He did not say anything else about it, but he refilled Abraham's cup second, with a quality of pointed generosity that said something he was too dignified to articulate directly. The few days became a week. Ursa's leg had healed to the point of full function, and she no longer needed the cane, but she was in no apparent hurry to leave, and Abraham was in no apparent hurry to suggest she should, and the town of Coldtolow found itself processing their presence with the particular social complexity of a small community that has strong opinions and limited avenues for expressing them tactfully. The Fishers were generally favorable. The two Rothgar clan members who regularly traded at Coldtolow's market were cautiously pleased. 3 of the older residents made pointed remarks in the market square that Abraham heard and did not respond to. A woman named Dunna, who ran the drying house, told Marta that it was unnatural, and Marta told Dunna that unnatural was a word people used when they meant unfamiliar, and that Dunna had herself married a man from 3 districts away who nobody had known, and that people had said that was unnatural too, and the conversation ended there. Ursa was aware of all of this. She had been aware of this kind of thing her entire life. The sideways looks, the conversations that stopped when she passed, the way certain people's faces arranged themselves around her. She did not let it show, and she did not change her behavior, and she was in the market square on the 6th morning buying dried fish and a spool of good linen thread for her bracers when the 3 older residents who had been making remarks chose to make one directly. The one who spoke was a man named Edric, who had been a dock worker for 30 years, and had the temperament of someone who had decided at some point that bluntness was a virtue that excused itself from consequences. He said in the square audibly, "Don't know what Brecken is thinking, letting something like her stay in town and sleep under a watchman's roof." The square was not empty. There were perhaps 12 people present at various stalls and passing through. Abraham came out of the baker's with a wrapped parcel under his arm. He had heard it from the doorway. He walked to Edric. He was not visibly angry. He said in a level, carrying voice, "Her name is Ursa Wildheart. She's a decorated warrior who settled a contract dispute that protects this, holds highland rights. She stayed under my roof because she was injured, and she stayed after that because I asked her to." He held Edric's gaze. "You can have whatever opinion you like about me and whatever I do in my own house, but I'll ask you not to refer to her as a thing in my town again." Edric opened his mouth. Abraham said, "She also carries twin short swords and has the patience of a woman who is choosing not to use them. I'd keep that in mind." There was a silence in the market square of Coldtolow. Ursa had turned from the dried fish stall. She was looking at Abraham's back. Her expression was unreadable, but her amber eyes were very bright. Edric said nothing. He walked away. His 2 companions walked with him. One of them, Abraham noticed, appeared to be suppressing a reaction of some kind that was not agreement with Edric. The woman with the basket at the cloth stall, the same woman who had clapped at Draven's Ford, or her exact local equivalent, which is to say someone who had seen enough of the world to know what mattered, said, to no one in particular, "About time." Ursa was beside Abraham when he turned. She said very quietly for him alone, "You didn't have to do that." "I know," he said. "I can fight my own battles." "I know that too," he said. "That wasn't a battle, that was just true." She looked at him. The amber eyes, bright and direct, with something moving behind them that she was not going to name, in the middle of the market square. She put her hand in his. Not over his hand, not against his face. Her hand in his, fingers between his fingers, warm and deliberate and entirely public. They stood like that in the square for a moment, and then she said, "Come on. You haven't eaten yet," and they walked to the inn. That evening, sitting in front of the hearth in the small house on the upper lane, she said, "I want to show you something." She pulled aside the collar of her bodice off her right shoulder. The honor mark was there, 3 lines of deep blue-green, old ink in strong skin. He had seen it before, but never this close. She said, "In Rothgar tradition, when a warrior takes a bondmate, they share the mark. Not the same mark, a companion mark. A different symbol, complementary." She looked at the fire. She said, "I haven't offered it to anyone." He was very still. He said, "What does the companion mark look like?" She looked at him. She said, "It's made by the warrior's choice. For you," she stopped. She said, "I know what I'd choose if you were willing." He looked at the mark on her shoulder for a moment. He said, "What does it mean? In the tradition, what does sharing it mean?" "That you are mine," she said simply, "and I am yours. That it is permanent and witnessed and done." He looked at her face. She was watching him with the unflinching directness of someone who has committed to honesty even when it makes her vulnerable, and he could see, clearly, that this vulnerability was costing her something, that the woman who had maintained dignity across an entire highland moor with an arrow in her thigh was having a harder time with this than with any of that, because this was the kind of wound she could not just exhale through. He said, "Where would you put it?" She reached out and touched his left forearm just below the inside of the elbow. She said, "Here, it's traditional if you consent." "Yes," he said. She stilled. She said, "Yes." "Yes," he said again, steady. She looked at him for a long moment. Then she reached into her pack and produced a small case of bone tools and a vial of blue-green ink, the same ink as her own mark, and he realized she had been carrying these and had not said anything about them for the entire journey, which meant she had been thinking about this for longer than he knew, and the understanding of this settled over him with a warmth that had nothing to do with the fire. Her hands were very careful. She was precise and focused, and she worked in silence except for when she asked him to hold still, which he did without effort because he was watching her face while she worked. The line of concentration between her brows, the specific tilt of her head. The mark she chose for him was two interlocking curves, the shape of a carried weight and the shape of a hand that holds, she told him afterward, and it took half an hour and it stung in a clean, certain way. And when she was done, she wrapped his forearm in a strip of clean linen and held his hand between both of hers and looked at him. He said, "Your turn." She looked at him. He said, "You said a companion mark. That means something complimentary. I'm not saying I can do what you did, I don't have the skill for that kind of work." He looked at the bone tools. He said, "But I can make a mark." She was quiet for a long moment. Then she rolled her left sleeve up and extended her forearm to him. He chose carefully, with a stick of charcoal first, drawing and redrawing until the shape was right and she had approved it. And then he worked slowly, and with the concentration of someone who understands that what he is doing matters and must be done well. He chose a simple shape, a lantern with an open door, the flame visible inside, the kind of mark a man who lights lanterns at night would choose as his own emblem. And she watched his bent head and his careful hands and said very quietly at the midpoint of the work, "You know what this is, don't you? What this means?" "I do," he said, not looking up. "That's why I said yes." She looked at his hands working and felt, with a completeness she had not been prepared for, that she was entirely at home. They left for the Hrothgar hold at Ironspire, 7 days after returning from Draven's Ford. Abraham had given his formal notice to Brecken, who had taken it with the expression of a man who had seen this coming, and had already been thinking about the town's night watch arrangements. He had given Abraham a letter of recommendation for whatever use it might be of, and a second wheel of cheese, and had stood in the gate at dawn watching them go with the specific dignity of someone who is moved, and has decided this is not the right audience for it. The road north along the fjord was spectacular in a way that highland roads often are when you have time to notice. The water far below catching the morning light, the cliff faces dark and sheened with damp, the narrow track winding between ancient stone walls that had been built by someone long dead for reasons that were now entirely architectural. Abraham walked with his pack on his back and Brecken's letter in his coat, and the new mark on his forearm under its linen wrapping, and Ursa walked beside him with her twin blades on her back, and the companion mark on her arm, and an expression of settled purpose that was the most beautiful thing about her, which was saying something significant. She told him about Ironspire as they walked. It was a proper highland hold, 20 longhouses above the deep fjord, with a great hall and smithing fires and a training ground, and a community of perhaps 200 people who had varying degrees of familiarity with outsiders. The war chief was a man named Draven who respected results above sentiment, and had sent Ursa south alone, because she was the best at what she did, not because he was indifferent to her. There were others at Ironspire she respected and who respected her. There were also, she said, people who would have opinions. "I've had opinions about me before," Abraham said. These opinions would be specifically about whether a human watchman is a fit companion for the Wildheart warrior, she said. "They will say it in more formal terms, but that is what they will mean." He thought about it. He said, "What will you tell them?" She said, without hesitation, that he carried me 3 miles across a dark moor when I needed it, stood down a merchant lord in a public square, and offered me a companion mark when I had not asked for one, and that any Hrothgar warrior who questions his fitness can present the challenge formally and then meet me on the training ground. He looked at her. She said, "I mean this literally. I'm not going to have this conversation more than once." "I know," he said. "I love you." She stopped walking. He had said it conversationally, in the middle of the road with the fjord 300 feet below and the highland sky enormous overhead, as if it were a fact that had simply arrived at the moment it needed to be said. He stopped too and looked back at her. She was standing in the road with her amber eyes on him and an expression that was doing several things at once, and she said slowly, "You are doing that thing where you just say the real thing instead of building to it. Is that a problem?" "No," she said. She said it like she was discovering this as she said it. "Oh, it's not a problem." She walked forward until she was close enough that she had to look down slightly to hold his eyes, and she put both hands on either side of his face and said, "I love you. I decided I did before we left Coldtalow the first time, and I have been carrying it around for a week being thoroughly annoyed about it." "Annoyed," he said, "because you make me feel—" She paused. She chose the word carefully. "Possible," she said. "Things feel possible with you. I had forgotten what that was like." He covered her hands with his, the way he always did, and he said, "Come on. I want to see Ironspire." And she laughed, actually laughed. The first time he had heard that, low and real and from somewhere uncovered, and they walked north together along the fjord road with the autumn light coming off the water below. Ironspire was everything she had described and something she had not. The 20 longhouses were built on a series of stone terraces carved from the fjord cliff, connected by stone stairs and narrow lanes, with the great hall at the crown and the smithy fires below throwing columns of amber smoke that were visible from miles away. The hold had walls of fitted stone and a wide gate decorated with the Hrothgar mark carved deep, and when they came through it in the early evening of the second day, the hold was in the full motion of supper preparation, smoke and voices, and the clang of the smith's hammer from below. People stopped. Not every person, a few continued what they were doing, but most of them stopped, because the sight of Ursa Wildheart coming home through the gate with a human man at her side, and both of them carrying each other's marks on their forearms, was not a sight they had seen before, and it was not one they knew how to categorize quickly. War Chief Draven came down from the great hall steps. He was a large man, older than Ursa by 15 years, with the look of someone who has made 1,000 decisions under pressure and has the face that this produces. He looked at Ursa. He looked at Abraham. He looked at their forearms. He said, "The contract is settled." "Fully," Ursa said. "Magistrate's confirmation is in my pack. Renwick's claim is void." Draven nodded. He said, "You were shot." "I'm fine." He looked at Abraham. He said, "You're the one who found her." "Yes." "And carried her to the hold at Coldtalow." "Yes," Draven said, 3 miles from what I heard." "The road was longer on the return trip," Abraham said. "It usually is." Draven looked at him for a long moment. He had the eyes of a man who could read other men, and he read Abraham with the specific attention of someone who has entrusted something precious to an unknown quantity and is now reviewing the outcome. He said, finally, "You'll need a place in the hold, and a role." "I have skills," Abraham said. "Watchman's work, reading, correspondence. I can be useful." Draven looked at Ursa. She met his eyes without any visible anxiety. He said, "The hold's correspondence files are a disaster. We've lost 2 disputed land claims in 3 years because our documentation was insufficient." He looked at Abraham. Mend that, and you'll earn your keep 10 times over." Abraham said, "I'll need access to everything in the file going back 10 years. "You'll have it." Draven turned and went back up the stairs. Several of the watching clan members exchanged glances. An older woman near the gate, the Hold's senior elder it turned out, a sharp-faced woman named Byrie who had been at Ironspire since before Draven's tenure, looked at them both with an expression of someone arriving at a conclusion. She said to Ursa, "Come to dinner. Bring your watchman." Ursa said, "He's mine, not just a watchman." Byrie said, "That's what I said." She walked away. There were over the following weeks people with opinions. Two young warriors challenged Abraham's presence in formal terms, which meant they went to Ursa and she said, as she had promised, that they could meet her on the training ground, and they both decided, after considering the implications, that this was not worth the consequence. A third came to Abraham directly, a man of 25 named Kor, who was broad and proud and not unintelligent, and he said plainly, "What are you to her?" Abraham said, "Hers." Kor said, "You're human." "I am," Abraham said. "And I'm going to be here for as long as she'll have me, which I believe is a long time. If that's a problem for you, I understand, but I'm not going anywhere." Kor looked at him for a long moment. He said, "She smiled at you this morning." "Yes." "She hasn't smiled at anyone in the Hold in 3 years, Kor said. He seemed to be weighing something. He said, "I'm not saying you're what I expected for her, but she looks different." "Different how?" Kor said, rested. He shook his head slightly. He went away. He was not unfriendly after that. He was cautious, which was honest, and Abraham found cautious more comfortable than false welcome. The winter came to Ironspire early, as it did in the highlands, the fjord going dark and choppy, the stone of the Hold's walls beating with cold. Abraham worked on the correspondence files, which were indeed a disaster, a decade of mixed documentation in 3 different hands with no consistent system. He created one. He read everything in the file and made cross-references and wrote summaries and flagged disputes and noticed, in the process, 3 potential legal vulnerabilities that the Hold had been sitting on without knowing it, one of which, if unchallenged, would have allowed a lowland noble to claim a road levy on the Hold's southern approach within 2 years. He told Draven. Draven read his summary. Draven said without inflection, "Handle it." He handled it. He wrote the letters. He filed the challenges. He tracked the responses. He sat in Draven's hall at the long table with the fire going and wrote correspondence by lamplight with the same unhurried steadiness he had brought to everything else. And by midwinter he had become, without announcement or formal designation, the Hold's administrator of legal documentation, which was a role that had never existed before and which everyone quickly agreed had been badly needed. Ursa had resumed her regular duties, which involved training the Hold's younger warriors and periodic patrol of the highland boundary. She was back to full capacity within 2 weeks of arriving at Ironspire. She had pushed the recovery by sheer will and Marta's good initial work. She came back from training in the evenings to the room they shared in the eastern longhouse, which was larger than Abraham's house in Coldtolow, but had the same quality of warmth once she had arranged it to her satisfaction, with the stone hearth banked high, and the sleeping platform wide enough for 2, and the window facing the fjord so the sound of the water was always present under everything else. She would come in from the cold with her braids wind-blown and her cheeks dark from exertion, and she would find him at the table over the files, and she would lean over his shoulder from behind to see what he was working on, her chin near his temple, and he would explain it. And she would ask a question that went straight to the heart of the matter, and they would talk it through, and he never stopped marveling at the quality of her mind, which was as formidable as the rest of her, and in some ways more surprising. She would also, on evenings when the cold was very sharp and the Hold was loud with dinner sounds from the great hall, sometimes simply close the ledger in front of him with a firm hand and say, "Enough. Come to the fire," and he would come to the fire, and they would sit together in the specific warmth of 2 people who have chosen each other and do not need to explain it. There was a night in the deep of winter when the fjord was frozen solid for the first time in 5 years, and the hold was celebrating with a bonfire in the courtyard, and everyone was out, and the room was theirs alone. And she kissed him with the same deliberate focus she brought to everything that mattered, and he pulled her closer with the assurance of a man who has earned this and knows it. And the fire in the hearth was warm, and the bonfire's reflection played across the stone floor, and the night was long and good and private. And what passed between them was tender and urgent and fully theirs, neither of them in any hurry after months of building toward it, and in the blue hour before dawn she lay with her head on his shoulder, and he had his arm around her, and the hold was quiet below the window, and she said, "I did not think this was something I was going to have." He said, "What?" She said, "This." She pressed her hand flat against his chest. "Someone who stays." He put his hand over hers. He said, "I'm staying." "I know," she said. "That's what I said." He smiled at the ceiling. She felt it rather than saw it, and made a sound of contentment that she absolutely would have denied if anyone had asked, and they slept until the hold woke up around them, complete. Spring came to the highlands the way it always does, slowly and then all at once. The fjord unfroze. The training ground thawed, and Ursa resumed the outdoor drills with twice the participation she'd had in autumn, because several of the younger warriors had decided, over the winter, that being taught by someone who had stood down 6 guards in the plaza of Draven's Ford was probably worth whatever awkwardness had previously kept them at a distance. Abraham had, by spring, fully reorganized the hold's legal documentation, filed 4 challenges that had resolved in Hrothgar's favor, and earned a reputation as the man to bring an unusual problem to, which he had not anticipated but which suited him. Kor had become, with the slow, grudging certainty of someone who does not change their mind easily but does eventually, something close to a friend. Elder Byrie addressed him by name at dinner without the previous slight formality. The hold had, over the season, largely stopped treating his presence as an anomaly and had begun treating it as a feature, which is the best you can hope for and is, in the long run, what matters. The specific moment of completion came in early spring, when Brecken of Coldtlow came up the fjord road with a trade delegation. The first formal trade delegation between Coldtlow and Clan Hrothgar in 3 years, facilitated, it was quietly understood, by a combination of the settled contract and the correspondence work Abraham had done establishing clean documentation on both sides of the exchange. Brecken arrived at the Ironspire gate with 4 merchants and a cartload of lowland goods, and the same expression he always wore, which was that of a man who has calculated outcomes and is finding this one satisfactory. He went through the gate and was met by Draven, and then, behind Draven, by Abraham and Ursa standing together in the way people stand when they are entirely at home in the same place at the same time. Brecken looked at Abraham. He looked at the mark on his forearm, visible below his rolled sleeve. He looked at Ursa's forearm, the companion mark there. He looked at the hold around them, the longhouses and the fjord view and the training ground below where a dozen young warriors were drilling under a clear spring sky. He said to Abraham, "You look like you're staying." "I am," Abraham said. Brecken nodded. He said, "Good. The road was better for the filing, by the way. Renwick's road levy claim was formally dismissed last month. I thought you should know." Abraham said, "I heard." Brecken said, with the particular warmth of a man who has held something in for a while, "You were the best night watchman I ever had. Worst at staying, though." Abraham said, "I know." Brecken put his hand out. Abraham shook it. Brecken then turned to Ursa, and after a moment of the internal recalibration of a man who has never formally greeted an orc warrior on equal terms, but has decided it's past time to start, he extended his hand to her as well. She shook it with the contained formality of someone who is choosing to be gracious. She said, "Thank you for keeping him alive until I needed him." Brecken blinked. Then he laughed, a real and generous sound, and said, "Come on then. Let's see this haul of yours." The trade delegation dinner was held in the great hall of Ironspire that evening, with both holds present and the long tables full and the fire enormous and the food plentiful and the grain spirit freely distributed. Abraham sat at the main table between Ursa and Brecken, which was a geography of his life that would have seemed improbable a year ago, and which now felt as natural as breathing. Ursa was telling Brecken about the fjord freezing in winter, and Brecken was telling her about a storm that had taken out 2 of the dock lanterns last autumn, and Abraham sat between them and listened with the contentment of a man who has found the exact right place to be. Draven gave a formal speech that acknowledged the trade agreement and, indirectly but unmistakably, acknowledged Abraham's contribution to its foundation, and Abraham felt Ursa's hand find his under the table and press once, firmly, in the specific way she had of conveying something without saying it. Later, when the hall was loud and full and the night was going, Kor stopped beside Abraham with his cup and said, "You know they're going to make a story out of you." Abraham said, "What kind of story?" Kor said. "The human who carried the Wildheart warrior 3 miles in the dark and then stayed." He looked into his cup. "The clan loves a story. They'll be telling it for years." Abraham thought about Ursa keeping her eyes closed on the moor road, awake under the surface and choosing, for her own reasons, to let herself be carried. He thought about what it must have cost her to make that choice, what it meant, for a woman who carried everything alone, to let someone carry her even once. He thought about the companion mark on his forearm and the lantern mark on hers. He said, "Tell them the right version." Kor said, "What's the right version?" Abraham said, "She never needed saving. She needed someone to walk beside her." He looked at the hall around him, at the fire and the faces and Ursa's profile across the room, the strong jaw and the tusks and the amber eyes that were currently settling some kind of logistical argument with Byrie about road levies, fierce and lucid and completely alive. She just needed someone to do it for keeps. Kor was quiet for a moment. He said, "That's a better story." He raised his cup. "To the watchman." Abraham raised his. "To Ursa Wildheart," he said, "who knew where she was going the whole time." Across the hall she turned her head, as she always seemed to when he said her name, and their eyes met through the firelight and the crowd, and she tipped her chin at him slightly, the way she had started doing, which was her shorthand for something she had told him once in the small house on the upper lane and continued to mean every time she said it. "I see you. I chose you. I'm here." He tipped his chin back. The hall roared around them, warm and full. The first real trade dinner between Coldtalow and Clan Hrothgar in 3 years, and outside the highland night was cold and clear, and the fjord was dark and glittering far below. And Abraham Wallace, formerly a gravedigger, road laborer and night watchman, had found the thing he had spent 29 years quietly not knowing he was looking for, which was the warm, absolute certainty of being exactly where you are supposed to be. And Ursa Wildheart, warrior of the Wildheart bloodline, veteran of 2 campaigns and bearer of the honor mark and the most capable woman in 3 holds by common agreement, had found the thing she had been telling herself she didn't need, which was someone to whom she was not a reputation or a force or a useful instrument, but simply herself, fully known and completely wanted. She had chosen him on the dark moor road, in the moment between staying conscious and not, when she could have made any choice, and she made the one that kept his arms around her. She had never admitted it. She did not admit it now. She held it instead in the way she held everything that mattered most close, certain, kept. He knew anyway. He had known since the morning in the infirmary doorway when she told him she had been conscious the whole time, not as a confession but as a declaration, the way warriors announce the things they intend to keep. They walked home from the great hall late, through the hold stone lanes in the spring night, his arm around her shoulders and hers around his waist, past the training ground and the smithy fires gone cold for the night and the great view of the fjord below, black and enormous and permanent. The stars were out in full. The hold was settling into its night sounds around them. She said at the door of their longhouse, "Kor was talking to you." He was. What did he say? He said they'd make a story out of us. She looked up at the stars for a moment. She said, "What story will they tell?" He opened the door. The fire inside was banked low and the room was warm, and it was theirs. He said, "The one where you chose me." She looked at him, the amber eyes in the dark with the fjord stars behind her, unguarded and certain. She said, "That's the whole story." "Yes," he said. She stepped through the door. He followed her in. The door closed on the highland night, on the fjord and the stars and the stone hold of Ironspire, on 3 miles of dark moor road, and the sound of his footsteps and her closed eyes and the arrow stub and the lantern on his belt, and the first cold step of something that had turned out to be, in every way that counted, exactly as permanent as a mark pressed into skin.